Hello, good evening. Thank you everyone very much for joining us. My name is Alex, and tonight I'm delighted to welcome celebrated author and professor Andre Aciman to the Cambridge Union. Andre is perhaps best known for his novel Call Me By Your Name, which was published to critical acclaim in 2007 and adapted into an Oscar-winning film starring Timothée Chalamet and Armie Hammer in 2017. He is also currently Distinguished Professor at the Graduate Center of City University of New York and has published many other novels, memoirs, and essay collections, the most recent of which is Homorealis, which was published this January. I'll start off by asking a few questions, and if you, any of our wonderful viewers, have any that you wish to submit, then we will have time for those towards the end, and the link to the form is in the description. So Andre, just to kick things off, why don't you start by telling us a bit about your latest work, Homorealis, and what inspired it?
What inspired it is a very long story, so I won't go into that. But what the book is about, it addresses many authors, one composer in particular, Beethoven, and a painter and a movie director, a poet, and so on. And what I do with each of them is that I narrate at the very beginning my personal biographical encounter with each. And from there, I begin to analyze what these these famous minds, among them, by the way, is Freud, who occupies quite a bit of space in the book. I'm trying to find out not what they said, I leave that to other critics, but what they have said to me, without being totally personal about their meaning to me personally. I'm trying to find out what have they been able to externalize that I had in me thanks to them. So when I look at a painting by John Sloan, for example, it's about old New York. I never lived in old New York. I don't even know it. I couldn't have been that old. But at the same time, it said something to me that maybe the painter, the composer, the psychoanalyst, the poet, the writer, etc., were not quite sure they meant to say, but that they meant to me. And so what I call fundamentally a misreading is simply my attempt to understand what they meant, what they didn't know they could have meant, what they possibly might never even accept my interpretation of what they meant. That's all right. They spoke to me. And what they said to me is mine. And therefore, I'm trying to understand myself through them.
Fantastic. And was this a project that you started before the pandemic, or was it something that you sort of found was affected by it at all?
No, the pandemic had no business with it. The book was signed personally before the pandemic. It's not about, I don't, by and large, you will find that I don't like to write about events as they are occurring in the present. They need to have essentially died for me to write about them. Same thing with authors, same thing with anything. I don't like the present tense, which is what the book is about. It's why is it that I don't know how to inhabit the here and now, and that I keep slipping into this might have been, could have been, should have been, etc.
Amazing. And what is your sort of writing process like? And does it differ between different kinds of medium that you're writing? So maybe for a novel versus, say, an essay collection?
Well, sometimes I will get a call and somebody will say, would you mind writing a piece about such and such? And I always say yes, because sometimes it's months ahead. I say, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And then, of course, the night before, or let's say a few weeks before, they call me and they say, have you finished the piece? And I say, oh my God, I haven't even thought about it, let alone even begun it. But what happens is that as I begin to write this thing that I dread because I didn't want to write it, but that's not true of everything. But as I begin to write anything, I find myself entrapped by the sentences. And I find myself, as I go on, I begin to take seriously something that was just a complete burden. In other words, the way I like to phrase it, I fall in love with something that I purely detested, simply because I've tinkered with it so much under pressure that I fall in love with it. Now, when I write a book, I might start a book and say, nah, this is not going to go anywhere, but let me keep going. The keeping going is what makes me fall in love with it. So I don't fall in love with a project from the start. I fall in love with it as I keep working on it. And then I can't stop writing it. And I want to finish it as fast as possible. And I don't want to finish it as fast as possible because I want to defer the pleasure. But at the same time, I have other things that I need to do, other things I've said yes to that and sort of it snowballs. But for me, the process of writing anything in life is that you have to fall in love with it. And I say that to my students. You may not like the assignment. It may be burdensome. But eventually you have to find a way of falling in love with it. And why does one fall in love with it is because you finally discovered something about yourself. Even as you're writing a silly thing as a book review, you're in it somehow. You've wedged your way in and infiltrated it. And now you're there. And of course, since you're seeing some part of you, you may not like yourself, but you like what you're producing. You like the courtship with language.
And do you feel that for any of your works in particular, you have learned something particularly profound that's kind of changed your views or opinions on a certain topic that you maybe weren't expecting?
No, no. Well, because there's a reason for that, is that I don't have views. I'm not interested in anything that basically engages thematics, themes, isms, identity issues. These are not for me. They're for other people. They don't speak to me. I do find that as I'm writing probably with a sense of purpose about something that I'm trying to uncover. I may not know what I'm uncovering, but the process of uncovering is sort of important. I seldom conclude anything I write with a sort of the cymbals are suddenly sort of being played and you can hear the fanfare. There's no closure to anything I write because I haven't arrived at anything. I'm just sort of keep going. And so that sentence that you read in my book many, many times, it appears in almost every essay, there might have been, that could still be, but hasn't occurred, but could still be, and may never occur, though you wish it does, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, that sentence, in fact, is exactly where I exist. It's where I write. In other words, there's nothing that's going to be conclusive. I will not discover something that I didn't know beforehand. Just as my readers, when they read my books, they don't learn anything. There's nothing to learn. They've already thought about it millions of times. They've just never considered it, which is why they're moved, because they're finding something about themselves in my writing, the way I find things about myself in my writing.
And how do you feel when maybe someone analyzes text that you've written and perhaps finds meaning and themes that maybe weren't intended?
They could be brilliant, and they have been brilliant. There are many times when the audience will say something, when I'm giving a talk, and the audience will say, have you considered this? And I say, you know what? That's a fantastic interpretation of what I've done. Yes, you're probably more right than I thought I was. And people do this all the time. So I'm always open to different interpretation to what I do. And the reason is very simple, because it's so open-ended that there's no sense of closure or of something being thumped down as a definitive reading of my work. It could keep altering and changing and morphing as much as every reader needs to bring her interpretation of what I've done.
And do you have any sort of favorite authors at the moment, or particular books that you're enjoying reading, or perhaps a genre that you think is fantastic at this moment in time? Or does it change a lot?
No, actually I read only old books. I seldom read contemporary authors, although people talk to me about them all the time, and so I will give them a look. I will sort of see what they're doing. But I also think that writers tend to, they may not admit it. Oscar Wilde did, and I said that, I think, the other day at some interview, that essentially an author is always interested in what he or she has to say. If nobody else is saying it, then they're not that interesting. It doesn't mean that they're not better authors. I mean, look at James Joyce is probably the greatest writer of the 20th century in English. Okay, many of the things he does do not interest me, but I recognize the fact that he is a genius. I know that. And so I'm intimidated. At the same time, he's not somebody that I rush to read because we're not saying the same things.
And have you found there have been any sort of drawbacks perhaps in your literary career insofar as you had such success with one particular book that it's maybe meant you've been associated with that and only that rather than some of your other works?
Well, I've been lucky because I've had two books that have been quite successful and completely different, totally different. One has been published 25 years ago and is still in print, still available. You can still find it everywhere. The other one, of course, they made a movie out of it, so that is very successful. They're totally different voices, totally different stories, but at the same time, they're both by me, and so they contain a kind of my matrix is in both of them. Though it's completely, you wouldn't know it unless you were told. And people will always say, "Oh, we recognize your style right away." Well, maybe you do, and maybe that's what ties all my work together, the fact that it sort of bears the same style. At the same time, they're totally different stories. I try not to allow myself to be swayed by what I've done or by what the public wants or by what the public loves. That's not me. I'm just a writer who needs to write what basically gives me pleasure. And if it gives me a kind of pleasure, and by pleasure, I don't mean just intellectual pleasure or scriptorial pleasure. I also mean a certain degree of libidinal level pleasure. It has to affect some sort of libido. It doesn't have to be sexual libido, but it is a desiring machine that wants to keep this contact with the paper going. And I don't want to be distracted by what other people want or what they like or what they hate or whatever.
And did you then think when you wrote Call Me By Your Name, because I believe you wrote it relatively quickly for a book, when you finished writing it, did you ever anticipate that it might have a sequel or that it might be as popular as it was?
No, of course not. I told my agent, I don't think you're going to want to sell this book, but here it is, And I thought, first of all, I didn't want to publish it. And second of all, I didn't think anybody would want to read such a story. Why would they want to read this story? And then I get a call from a producer who says, we'd like to make a film out of it. I said, yeah, sure. And I didn't believe him at all, but he was persuaded me eventually. And eventually there was a film. So, but in fact, I'm totally, see, there's one thing that authors will not tell you or any artist will not tell you, is the degree of luck that they've encountered. And sometimes luck smiles twice, 3 times sometimes. In other words, it's always luck. The fact that somebody read the book and wanted to make a film out of it, the fact that somebody read another book and said, my God, this is my family, I can understand why this book is there. These are all lucky things that happen. And there are many authors out there who haven't been lucky and who should be lucky.
Yeah, and many authors are very possessive of their works, and so if they are adapted into a film, for example, they have a very sort of hands-on approach with the script. And as I understand it, you had quite the opposite. You more trusted the director and James Ivory, the screenplay writer, to kind of do their own thing. And I wondered why that was and why you went for that approach to your work as opposed to maybe the other, which many authors will adopt.
Well, let's say that I resisted what they suggested and it proved to be a flop. That would be my fault, wouldn't it? Okay. No, but in essence, James Ivory and Luca Guadagnino were already masters at their craft. They knew what they were doing. I figured, who am I? Just a writer. I'm not a movie person. I don't understand film. I don't go to the movie theater that much anyway. So what am I going to tell them? How to do their business? No, I've had my say. Let them have theirs. And I love the fact that I gave them the freedom to do whatever they wanted to do.
And perhaps on Call Me by Your Name, do you think that homosexual romance is inherently more complicated than heterosexual romance? And was that a factor in why you wrote a story about that?
No, I wrote the story because it started by being a heterosexual relationship between, two 17-year-olds, a girl and a boy, and they were going to have sex, and it was going to come, of course, quite easily. And okay, then what? Then I'm stuck with plot, am I not? And I'm terrible with plot. The parents will not like the girl, the parents may not like the boy, they may not like the relationship, their friends may make fun of them. I couldn't care less about this. Once I made it between two men, then at that point, something else happened. There was an inhibition that was put in place by whatever it was, society, whatever you want. Even an internalized inhibition. Whenever you desire someone, you're shy because your desire makes you almost guilty of something. I was talking about sort of straight sex desire. Calling someone to ask them out to go to the cinema is itself something that you hope they never pick up the phone, even though you want to go to the cinema with them. And I think that when you have reluctant inhibition, timidity, indecision, and all those other factors thrown in, and this huge inhibition that Elio has in just telling Oliver that he is attracted to her, maybe more than just attracted. And he doesn't even say it. He says it so indirectly and obliquely that if Oliver was not on the same wavelength, he wouldn't have understood what he's talking about. That scene in front of the statue in the film, for example, there is no way that Oliver could have inferred what he's talking about, except if he was already himself sort of quietly interested, or at least eager to reciprocate. And that is very difficult. It's very difficult to tell someone that you are attracted to them and that you want more than just friendship. Those are moments that freeze us on the spot. And many times we hope we've never even gone there because we know how awkward it must be for the other person. You feel for their awkwardness. In fact, if they say, no, I'm not really interested, or I've got somebody else, God, you feel that they feel, oh, God, why did he talk to me this way? You feel for their pain in spite of the fact that you are being rejected. So that position is what I wanted to capitalize, because among other things, you probably have heard me say this, I am terrible when it comes to plot. I'm not interested in plot. I'm more interested in what happens, let's say, in Find Me, when the father, Sammy, sits in the cafe with Miranda, and they're looking at each other. And it is clear that something is happening. They're not aware of it yet, but they will become aware of it soon enough. And essentially, it is that moment of awkwardness between human beings before something like intimacy occurs that I find magical. That moment of awkwardness that is about to become something else. If only you have the courage to go with it. And that's what the father does, and that's what Miranda especially does. He's not going to do anything because he thinks it's a lost cause, whereas she is interested.
And did it feel particularly groundbreaking while you were writing it? Because I suppose maybe nowadays we would look at the success of the book and of the film as well and say, to have such an open and almost the fact that they're gay doesn't, or their relationship is gay doesn't really matter in the same way that perhaps in previous stories it maybe has been a huge point of conflict or it can't happen. It is presented quite naturally. Did it feel like you were particularly challenging taboo or not really?
No, this is the problem. I mean, this is the enduring thing about me as a writer. I am not aware of what I'm doing. I mean, vis-a-vis the existing canons and the ways of behavior. If you notice, every single gay story ends with a fundamental tragedy at the end. If you think, the metaphor I like to use is that every opera, every play in the 19th century, if there were two women, one of the women had to die of tuberculosis. And you can hear her coughing in Act 2. In Act 3, she's on her deathbed, okay? So, I mean, did I want that? No, I didn't want that. I wanted two people who are having a good time falling in love with each other and never thinking about the dangers and never allowing what society will say to intrude on them. They just don't want the father to know or the mother to know, which is why, you know, Al Oliver will say to Elio, cool it, I think they know. But then eventually the father did know. And guess what? Rather than condemning or kicking the kid out of the household, he says, you know, if it hurts, let it hurt you. It's not a bad thing.
And the coming out scene in particular is a very moving one. I was wondering whether there was anything you based it on, or how you went about writing it in a way that was, you know, it wasn't done in a sort of, oh my goodness, we're going to have a massive fight about this, as you've suggested is often the case. But it is quite sort of, you know, it's not a big deal, which I think was quite refreshing.
No, I wrote it very easily. It just came as naturally to me as if I were giving advice to my kids or if my father were speaking to me. What was difficult instead was writing the confession scene between Oliver and Elio. That was a hard scene to write because I didn't want him to say, I think I'm attracted to you. I may have feelings for you. I didn't want that. That is so gawky. So I had him speak obliquely, but then in order for him to speak obliquely and be understood, it took a lot of writing. That was a difficult scene. The scene with the father was an easy one. The father is just basically giving him a kind of, if I may trivialize it for a second, although I don't mean to, it's Laertes' speech to his son in Hamlet, you know. It's, you know, to thy own self be true, blah, 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 blah. It's like almost cliches, but they had to be arranged in such a way. And what I loved about the film is that they basically took the speech as is and didn't change it at all. And I was very grateful for that.
And what was it that led you to have what would be, I think, by most considered a quite tragic ending in Call Me By Your Name, and then to sort of revisit it again in Find Me, and then have a more sort of traditionally happy ending, if you will, romantically?
Well, because when people were reading Call Me By Your Name, they were all very sad at the very end because the two were saying goodbye to each other. What I kept telling people, they're not saying goodbye to each other. This is what Elio is imagining is going to happen. It's written, as you probably know, in the conditional mood, which is an irrealist mood. Most of my books end in the conditional, not in the past, not in the present. They end in the conditional. When it's time for us to say goodbye, I hope you will, blah, 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 blah. It's not happening. He's not leaving. And I keep telling people he's not left. I let you assume that he's leaving, but he's not leaving. And in fact, I was trying to tell people that this is the ending to the story.
And you mentioned also at the start, when you originally were writing Call Me By Your Name, that it was a heterosexual romance between two 17-year-olds. I was wondering whether you were perhaps surprised by the commentary that then followed about the age gap between Elio and Oliver, and then perhaps even in Find Me, there are even in greater age gaps, and what your thoughts were on that.
Basically, I was writing fiction, and it never occurred to me that that was going to be even an issue. You know, a man who goes out with another man who is, one is almost 60 perhaps, and the other one is in his early 30s. Miranda is half the age of Samuel. And of course, there's Elio and Oliver. They're 7 years apart, but Elio is also minor. But it never occurred to me. This was fiction, and that's how I went with it. Though I understand that it could trouble some people because it has the germ of what people would consider, though it's not the case, a predatory relationship. And if you look at it, it is Elio who makes the moves. It is Elio who goes into the bedroom. It is Elio who basically puts pressure on Oliver. It's not Oliver. Oliver is basically telling him, no, it would be wrong. I don't want to do this. But if you want to cast a whole predatory thing, then it would be. But I never thought of it this way. And the fact is that most people don't. Some people have raised it, but you raise it because it's an issue. But there's absolutely nothing that is even the remotest sense of pressure on Elio. It's the other way around. So, but I sort of, when it came to Miranda and Sammy, I liked the age difference. It made it, otherwise you would have two senior citizens, as we call them here in America, discussing their grandchildren or their puppies. What is your grandchild called? What is he going to do? Well, he's still sort of in kindergarten. How about yours? Well, I can care less about that. This is dead on arrival. This is not what I wanted. But an older man who meets a younger woman who actually, he's not going to put the make because he knows there's absolutely no chance. It is she who does. And he's always questioning it, I think, in his head. Is this real? Is this happening? I don't think this could be it. But she is basically forcing his hand.
And in your mind, is Elio a homosexual, or is he bisexual, or do you think it doesn't really matter?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't know. I think that he's probably bisexual. I suppose that's what he is. I would like to think that everybody is, in one way or another. More or less, if you want. But that's a fact of life. I think everybody has, if not done, at least fantasized. And the fact is that, again, notice that the word gay never appears. The word AIDS doesn't appear. These nomenclatures have always been annoying for me. In other words, how are you going to label this? If you go to another novel I've written called 8 White Nights, the main character, who's the narrator of the story, doesn't even tell you his name. You never know what he's called. You know his nickname. And it's a nickname that is given to him by his would-be girlfriend. She just jokes and gives him this nickname. But you don't know his name. What does he do for a profession? We don't know. What are his ambitions? We have absolutely no idea, because it's of no interest. And that's the same reason why I wouldn't tell you if Elio is gay, or if Oliver is gay or straight or bi or whatever. I hate these terms. I mean, they work for a lot of people. They are cramping my style, so I don't use them. I try not to go there.
And I suppose it's interesting you talk about detail, because there's so much detail goes into things like the setting and all of that is maybe the focus. But I suppose, does that just mean you chose to prioritize that element of the writing over the details of their personal lives and things like that?
I don't know. This is the irony of the whole thing, especially about Call Me By Your Name. Most people say, you've made Italy come alive for me, or something along those lines. Actually, I haven't. I don't describe anything in Italy. I tell you what the smell of the plants are. I tell you there's a smell of coffee rising from the kitchen around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the maid and the cook are making coffee after they've had lunch. You can hear the wetting stone. But that's it. There are no details. There's a beach, there's a tennis court, there's a swimming pool. But that's not Italy. That could be anywhere. And in fact, I don't know why people insist that I've given you this vision of Italy. I don't remember doing that, nor would I know how to, and I wouldn't even be interested, because I never described. Have I described Elio to you? I don't describe him. You have no idea. You don't even know, as I didn't know, as I was writing the book, whether he was a blonde-haired kid or whether he was dark-skinned and had a hairy body. I have no idea. And I don't describe Oliver either. I only describe his the heel of his foot, and his arm, the bottom of his forearm. That's about it. There's no description of character. I have no patience for description of character. Oh, let me give you the face. The nose was such and such. The lips were such that. Oh, how boring. Let other people do this. I don't do it. I'm more interested in the energy that somebody conveys.
And I suppose, was an extension of that the decision not to give Elio's father a name until the sequel?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. He doesn't have a name. The mother certainly doesn't have a name. Even, I think even in the sequel, she doesn't have a name. Okay, it's because I'm reluctant to give names. I'd rather give you a nickname. And the reason why I took Sammy as a name is because after the film, the character has a name, and I couldn't give him another name, and I couldn't not give him a name. So I gave him the same name. That's the only thing I took from the film, is the name of the father, because I had to give him a name. Otherwise, I would have been perfectly happy calling him a professor.
That's fantastic. I'm going to move on to some of the many questions that we've had submitted,
Okay, fine.
if that's okay. But thank you so much for those. We've got one which is sort of related to some of the discussion we were having, which is from Emily at Girton, which is, how do you manage to make your novels so descriptive and realistic whilst also keeping them precise and to the point?
Well, because there are certain things that I enjoy describing. It could be many, but it's usually tiny details. I don't give you this kind of panoramic view that you get in Tolstoy, who's not a writer I particularly like. There's a sense of, I want to describe, let's say, the collarbone of a woman, for example. That is arousing. It's basically, I could describe I didn't want to describe you could see her bosom and whatever through the shirt. No, I like the collarbone, leave it at that. The chin or something like that, or a piece of music, just name it and that's it. I go with very flimsy details, but the details that I give make me happy. They almost, you would say, they don't arouse me sexually again, but they arouse my imagination. And that's what I want to give. And my emphasis is not on details, it's more on style. I want my sentences to have a particular rhythm to them and a particular cadence, so that, I always say this, that the reader will eventually accept. It's not easy to accept my style initially, but once you accept it, because you've been reading 2 pages, you've basically made your pact. Once you accept the style, then you can begin to go into the style. The style forces you to go inside the head of the characters or the head of the narrator, and you begin to find yourself espousing their consciousness, which is what I want. So any attempt on me to give you details is simply to allow you to borrow my consciousness.
And kind of following on from that, a question from Zachary. How do you approach and evolve the psychology of your characters when you construct them? And have they been influenced at all by any works of classical literature?
Well, I wouldn't know how to answer that, because I steal all the time. I steal from this writer, that writer. I will borrow. I will borrow from my life, from the life of my friends, from things that I make up. I also make up a great deal, just to make it cohesive. But I don't believe, put it this way, if you believe that people change, then you're not in agreement with me. I think people don't change. They haven't changed since they were children. In fact, the person that you hated when you were in kindergarten, if you met him when you're now 30, you will just as much hate him now. You may learn to forgive him, but you still hate him if you are honest with yourself. So I don't believe that characters change. Even if you think about, take for example, a great novel called Emma by Jane Austen, you would expect the character of Emma to, having gone through several defeats and sort of enlightening defeats, would change. she really doesn't change. She remains very much the same, except that she's been chastened quite a few times by her experiences and her mistakes. That's all it is. I don't believe that people change. And characters will not basically evolve to become a different character. That's too much to ask of any human being. They seldom change. I mean, they may learn how to camouflage their defects. They may learn to be aware of what some of their shortcomings are and will not sort of give them heed or sort of pay attention to them. But at the same time, they're still the same.
And what do you think causes these defects? Do you think people are born with them, or do you think things happen to them which then scar them potentially for life?
Well, with the exception of myself, because I was born perfect, you see. No, of course not. We have defects, we have way, because basically the defects come out when we're in social situations. In other words, we are uncomfortable. We say something we should never have said. We hurt somebody's feelings, sometimes because we wanted to, but most of the time because we did it unintentionally. But now that we've done it, we're now guilty of it, and there's no stepping back. So in essence, we are constantly trying to alter our behavior vis-a-vis other people. But our paranoia, if we have it, and I think all of us do, is still the same. We don't trust people. We try to teach ourselves to take people as they are. How many times have you been told that? You know, accept people the way they are. I never have. I can't. I always criticize people, especially behind their back. So, I mean, this is what we all do, but we don't want to claim we do. So we try in social circumstances, we learn how to control our worst instincts. But, you know, give us a few drinks and they'll come out.
That's very interesting way to look at it. Another question which we've had in is being an American Italian and having also been an Italian in Egypt, do you think your experience with alienation has contributed to your writing about gay love?
Oh, about gay love? I wouldn't know how to answer that. Well, because Italy, if you go to the main cities, is very, very open today and has been for quite a few decades about gay love. Egypt hasn't, of course, and may never. I mean, in certain cases, yes, but it's secretive. And I will say that what has shaped my sensibility is not necessarily to gay love, but to being Jewish, where when you're a Jew in Egypt, this is not an easy thing to be because you're constantly attacked as a Jew. And so you hide it. You hide your Jewishness just as people may hide their being gay. You know, so it's the same dynamic. You hide what is most profound in you. Being Jewish in Italy is not so simple. Certainly not in the 60s when people would say, "Oh, are you Jewish then?" And then you would say, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." And you can see that suddenly, not a wall rises, but you can see that they are deciding they're not going to say another word on the subject because they might offend you. But so you have a sense that all of it, every single human being, I believe, has something profoundly personal which they have to contain or hide from others. And one of the things that we hide from others is the fact, and I've said this so many times, I'm tired of saying it, is that we all feel that we are visitors to planet Earth, unlike everybody else we know. They're all Earthlings. We are just pretending to be Earthlings. We have just basically have to put so much effort in hiding the fact that we are different, that we are basically, as I like to say, sick and twisted, but we can't proclaim it. So we're constantly sort of muffling our instincts. And then you find out that everybody's like that. Everybody has a personal thing that they're constantly battling with. And if you didn't, you wouldn't be a human being.
I think you're probably right there. I would agree.
I don't know. That's how I feel.
I was wondering whether you think over the course of your lifetime, I presume you will have seen, particularly in countries like Italy and the US, attitudes towards minority groups generally improving. Um,
Towards what? Towards.
Towards different minority groups, so people like
Oh yes.
and LGBT people, and for example. But I wondered whether you think that is a trend that is going to continue, or whether you think maybe it might regress slightly.
Well, it has to continue. The job is by no means finished. It has to continue. I'm totally sort of on that side. But if you look at the latest polls in America, how many people voted for Trump? 72 million people voted for this imbecile. Okay, and how do you account for that? In other words, you have 72 million people, which is, I don't know how many times the population of many countries. 72 million people wanted to go back to a stage of history that has been altogether overcome and overwhelmed. They want to go back to having a white country, no foreigners, certainly no people from other countries like in Africa or Asia. Okay, that kind of movement, you would have laughed at it, I think, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But when it gathers 72 million people, of people who are voting for Trump, fundamentally, I mean, except for the multimillionaires, people are voting for Trump, I believe, because they are racists. Is this what we want in our world? To have racism become the dominant sort of value of so many people? So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of it. And it's a difficult job.
And do you feel that through, for example, very popular works of literature and that you might write that then become more mainstream, do you think that's something that is likely to help foster that goal, or do you think there are going to have to be other significant things done to reach out maybe to people who have kind of decided that they're going to be prejudiced for whatever reason?
Well, there's no reason to be prejudiced. That's the one thing. My books, I think, particularly Call Me and Find Me, have both basically helped a lot of gay people. A lot of gay people have essentially used those books as inspirations to come out to the world, to their parents, to their friends. And that's a good thing. That was never my intention because I never thought that far. But I'm happy that it has had that effect. How my books will help race relations? How will basically go back to certain parts of the United States where if you are gay, you probably will be killed. If you're outwardly gay, you will be attacked, beaten up, whatever, made fun of, sort of have people sort of turn boorish on you and bully you until you're out of the class, out of the school, whatever. This has to stop. I'm talking just about gay people. This has to absolutely stop. And if my books have contributed something to stopping that, all the better. But I still think that there are parts of the United States, many parts, particularly in the South, where being gay is still something that you keep secret and contained. And that's a terrible thing.
Yes, I would strongly agree from personal experiences as well. I think you're sadly probably right there. But it is interesting to consider maybe what we can all do to challenge that in the future. I have another question from one of the audience members. In your novels like Find Me and Call Me, you seem to often intertwine the scholarly endeavors of the characters with their personal life and love stories. Is that something you do deliberately to send a message about academia or research?
No, I mean, it's not to send a message. It's because of who I am. In other words, there are certain things that make perfect sense to me. I love great art and I love great books. I love great music. And occasionally, if I need to have something sort of tossed into the book that is about a painter or about a musician, a composer, I will give the ones that I love. And I will quote passages from books that I love if they are relevant. If they are relevant. For example, in Call Me By Your Name, the scene when the two are walking in the streets of Rome and they happen to see a person masquerading as Dante reciting a poem. Nobody has read that poem in America, I think, or very, very few know that poem, but it's a beautiful poem. And I give it, I'll spell it out, and I enjoy that. There's something magnificent about great, great art. And I like to evoke it when it matters.
And was there any art or anything really in particular that really inspired you to begin writing from perhaps an early age?
I think it was my father, because he encouraged me to write poetry. Nobody told me to write poetry. I did, because he said, why don't you write poetry? I said, you mean like stuff that I read in books and that I have to learn by heart at school? He says, yeah, write your own. So I did. And he told me it was fantastic. And so I wrote another one, and he said, that one is even better. And I kept doing that. Of course, it probably was dreadful stuff that I don't have anymore, but the encouragement is what I needed. And he gave me that encouragement. And sometimes he would help me fix it a tiny bit. And he gave me a present, a thesaurus, which I still have. I still own the same thesaurus that I got at the age of 10. And I occasionally use it, but I prefer the one on the net because that's easier to use. But in many cases, it was writing poetry that really seduced me. And eventually I realized that it took me quite a few years to realize that I was not going to be a good poet. I was not a good poet. And I decided I was going to do prose. And as I like to say, I wrote prose with one ear of a poet, so that my prose is always quite graceful. At least it tries to be graceful, even when it tells you things that are so abominably sloppy and about body and so on. Still, you have to do it with a degree of grace. And people like it, and I like it. Otherwise, I would never be able to describe excrement or vomit directly. This is not something I know how to do. But to explain it, the peach scene, for example, you have to do it with a degree of caution, tact, and at the same time not sort of totally mitigate the erotic aspect of it.
And I guess erotic elements of stories are perhaps some of the hardest to write, because I think, as you mentioned earlier, that maybe the temptation is to cringe, or and as you maybe did with the dialogue between your characters. How is that something that you sort of work through? Do you just keep writing until you read something that you think, okay, that's not awful?
Well, you have to do it with a degree of, as I say, you have to be very careful, because it is easy to say, whatever, the typical description of a scene, of sexual scene. It is very easy to do. There's nothing to it. All you have to do, export such and such in such and such a place, and so on and so forth. That does not. You also want to, what you want to capture in any erotic scene, as in any scene where you watch the sunset, you want to capture the part that moves someone, that will move you as the writer, and as I like to say, it will move you as the reader in 10 years when you read that scene and you say, oh, I see what I did. It wasn't so bad. In other words, you're writing for yourself in 10 years, not just for yourself right now, but you're also writing for readers. And you have a sense that what you want to capture in the sexual act is the magic of it, the beauty of it, the unexpected fact that something is happening between two bodies. There's a scene in Call Me By Your Name, which is a very erotic book, where the two are in bed together. They're both completely naked, and they're touching their feet. Elio is touching Oliver's foot. And it's an amazing point of contact. In other words, instead of going to the obvious parts, I'm going to the feet, because if you can imagine what a foot feels because it belongs to somebody else. It's not your foot, it's somebody else's foot. And you're trapping it and you're coddling it with your own foot. And at some point, Oliver will ask Elio, what are you doing? And Elio, feeling embarrassed, he's just touching his foot. They're naked meanwhile, okay? He says, nothing, that sort of expression. So it's by describing things that are slightly removed from the main aspect of what you expect from sexual act, is that you really feel that, oh my God, they're really naked with each other. Okay, and there's a scene in which, and I'm just going to stop there because otherwise it becomes not what I want. But there's a scene in which Elio feels that although he's naked, he feels that the sheet is over him, and he can feel the sheet in a particular part of his body, and which reminds him that he's actually naked. Because you tend to forget that sometimes. And so these are the little things that magnify the emotive aspect, even the most brutal sexual act that you can ever imagine. If there's an emotive component to it, then it's powerful. And as I said, you look at the sunset. It's not just say, look at the sunset, look at this tangerine color over this and that. It has to be moving. Otherwise, it's wasted.
And do you think that through that you maybe are looking to write in a way that is more intimate, perhaps, than erotic, and that's inherently more interesting to read?
Well, yeah, you've said the right thing, because there is intimacy, as I like to say. Intimacy is the most beautiful thing that can exist between two human beings, between you and a work of art. It's the intimacy that is magical. And so it is the intimacy that you want to express. It is the intimacy between two people who are in love that is what matters. It's not even if they're in love that matters. It's the intimacy, the fact that they are so open to each other, that nothing comes in the way, that the last secret, as Elio will say, the last secret has been revealed. There are no more secrets. And that is probably the best thing, the absolute best thing in any romantic situation, is the feeling of this person knows me better than I know myself.
And when you write, do you write with a paper and pen, or do you type? Because I can
No, computer, it's computer. If I wrote with paper and pen, then I'd have to type the page, then I'd make corrections, and I'd be typing the same page for, 2 months. And this has happened in the past. So word processing is magical for me. It has allowed me to be a writer. Because without that, I would be constantly correcting. That was the wrong word. Actually, it was the right word. I shouldn't have erased it, and I'm putting it back. New page being typewritten. It's a disaster, and I've stopped that. But writing on a computer is much easier because you can constantly edit, and it doesn't cost you anything.
And do you have any advice for young writers that you think maybe would have helped you when you were starting out?
The advice was given to me by my father, but he didn't give it to me as advice to a writer. It was basically advice. It was always to read the classics. Only the classics. Don't bother reading anything contemporary, because you'll end up sounding like it. Now, most people want to be published, and so they look at what's being published today, and they feel that they can emulate this voice or that particular voice. And I say that's such a waste of time. You'll end up sounding like them. Find out what your song is. What is the song that you're dying to sing? Not their song, not their instruments, yours. We all have, as I said, we all have something about us that we keep hidden. Go there. Go there. Have the courage to go there. Because if you don't have the courage, then you're going to sound like everybody else. They all are very safe writers. Most of them are safe. And there are some books that are, occasionally I read books that are sent to me because for some reason on a list somewhere, and I get books and I say, my God, this was fantastic. But as I said to somebody recently, I discovered Fernando Pessoa about 10 years ago. It's a totally Portuguese writer that I consider now one of the great geniuses of the 20th century. Uh, I, I love to read something that is going to throw me completely off, that's going to sort of enchant me to such a degree that I'm so happy to have lived this long and have read this book. I can't say that of many, many books that are written today. They don't enchant me that way. Yeah, they're good, they're entertaining, there's this and that, but they don't move me. So write, if you're a young writer trying to write about that thing that you have, and possibly you are almost believing that nobody else has and can understand. And guess what? If you out it correctly, everybody will say, yeah, I've always had that, but I've never read about it before. I mean, if you remember, just let me finish with this. If you remember when Call Me By Your Name came out, when it came out in 2007, I don't know how many gay stories were out there about people who were happy being gay and were not particularly sort of bullied or offended or killed. It was just an unusual story. Why did I do that? Because it came out somewhere in me. It came out from me, and I was going to be honest enough to go with that.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to finish. Thank you very much
Thank you very,
for
very
your
much.
time, and thank you for such an interesting and engaging conversation. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. You've done your homework. I know you have, and I want to thank the public too, because I have no idea how many there were or who they are. But thank you all for being here, and let's hope that next year, when I can travel back to the UK, I did a talk in Cambridge, I think last year, and I was very happy with that. That was lovely, and we should do it again. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. We
Thank
would
you
love to
again.
have you, and thank you everyone for watching. We really appreciate you coming along. Have a wonderful weekend, and we hope to
Yes.
see you at our next event. So thank you.
Okay. Take good care, Alex. Thank you so much. Bye bye.